Evening, everybody. So we are on Prep Test 89, and we are talking about the reading comprehension section tonight. Um, and as we were saying before I hit record, reading comp is oftentimes the one that we feel like we should be be the best at because we've spent our lives reading, and is oftentimes the section that is the hardest to improve at. Whether that is something inherent in the setup of the content itself, or whether that's something internal in us that we resist improvement because to undo so many of the ways that we think about reading is so challenging. Um, so this section, I think, in a lot of ways, more than the others, really requires three reviews because you're really battling your intuition in a much bigger way. We have intuitions; they're deeply ingrained about the ways that we understand text. We work really hard um, to undo those intuitions by doing review and having new goals. So the analysis of the passage itself is as critical as anything here, and taking that blind review session to think of the passage on its own and to understand it for what it is, because the truth is, the same passage could be used 5 times with 5 sets of 7 questions, and they wouldn't have to ask the same question anytime other than what the main point is. So every passage you can learn a lot about the kinds of questions they can ask, the kinds of ways that things are put together, and ways in which your intuition has biases about the ways you read things and the ways you go about reading things. So I think that that blind review and that strategy planning session on reading comp is really critical. So some of the baseline here on triple review: when you do your time section, you should be annotating, but you should be annotating very lightly. It really shouldn't be much. Keith and I are partial to the idea that annotating for structure is much more important than trying to pick out what you think are potential answers to questions. Find ways that the paragraphs and the passage as a whole are put together. Look for transition words. Look for indicator words. Look for ways that the passage tells you what sentences agree with each other and which ones disagree with each other. Find main points paragraph by paragraph and underline them. But really your goal should be, I need to understand what's happening, not what's here. Make sure in your time section you skip hard passages and leave them for the end, unless you are at a point in which you are getting all but 2 or 3 questions right on 3 passages. It's going to be very hard to justify going to all 4. That's going to be very hard. So doing 3 passages exceptionally well is almost always better than attempting all 4, because that 4th one, presumably, you're skipping the hardest one of the bunch for you. And chances are, if it's 6 questions, best case scenario, you're getting 3 right. And if you guess randomly, you're going to get 1 or 2 right. So really your time is better spent making sure that those first 3 are in really good shape. Anything on time section, Keith, or we want to push on here?
The one thing that I want to say is that I think one of the reasons people are so reluctant to give up their reading habits is that you're trained in college to read for content. And what we're trying to get you to do is realize that there's too many details here to absorb all the content. If you have some prior knowledge, okay, maybe you can take a stab at it. But if the information is new to you, it seems to me that the only way to organize it is going to be through the structure. And so that's a big leap for people to say, I'm going to essentially ignore the content or make the content secondary so that I can be perfectly sure that I have the structure correct. But I gained a lot more traction on RC when I started doing it that way than when I tried to brute force and just remember all the content or understand all the content. It's too much. So
Yeah.
the structure gives you the hooks that you can go back to find the content. If you ignore the structure, then you're sunk. You have nothing to go back to when you've forgotten the details.
Yeah, Naya?
When you guys say read for structure, do you mean like in the first paragraph they introduce the main point and so on and so forth?
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, we're going to talk a little more in the blind review section about what it means to find structure. Um, but in a lot of ways, it's very similar to what we're looking at in LR, right? Because in an LR section, when you read a stimulus, you're not reading it to understand the issue at hand. You're reading it to understand that there's a point trying to be made, and they make it in a certain way, and that's kind of what we're trying to do here. So, if we go on to the second big bullet point, right? We look at what we're doing in blind review. What you want to be able to do is take a look at the entirety of the passage and break it down according to some form of structured analysis. And there are a lot of forms out there, right? There is our LR form, and that's what I call macro micro LR, right? Where you're looking for what paragraph by paragraph, what is it argumentative or is it informational? If it's argumentative, what's its claim? What evidence did it provide? Did it provide you with rules that justify the claims that they're making? And then as you interconnect paragraphs, how do the claims line up with each other in order to justify one big claim? Remember, we were talking about subsidiary conclusions, right? In a lot of ways, you can think of each paragraph as being a subsidiary conclusion that serves as a piece of evidence for one big main claim. And that's really how the passage can be analyzed. But that's only one way to analyze a paragraph. You could analyze it a different way if it strikes you. And frankly, I think having many different structures to analyze paragraphs with is powerful, because that allows you in the moment to say, oh no, this passage, IRAC, is much better than macro micro LR because they asked me a question. They told me what the issue was. So that was really obvious. And they told me what the rules were. They told me what sort of world I was in which there was stricture. And then it went on to analyze the evidence in front of me and gave me a conclusion at the end. This smacks of IRAC. Other ones are very clearly scales of justice, where you have two competing ideas, and we're going to weigh them over the course of the passage and finally come to a conclusion at the end. So ultimately, what I would want to arm you with is not one single way that you always analyze every paragraph with, because there are going to be exceptions and there are ways that it doesn't work, but rather many forms, many systems to analyze paragraphs. And we say, what's the best one for this? So in blind review, that's when you get your opportunity. How is it best to understand this paragraph? How is it put together? Do they ask a question up front? Is there an issue they're trying to solve? Or is this merely a chronicle of ideas over the course of time? Are there two competing ideas, right? And if you can start verbalizing what those forms are for yourself, you keep a running catalog, just like you have in LR. What are the different ways they can make arguments in LR? They can analyze the past in order to make a prediction for the future. They can say that A causes B, right? There are certain sort of standard forms for it, and the same is going to be true here. So in blind review, the bulk of your time should be spent on the passage itself. Analyze the heck out of it. Right? Find every nuance, every connection, every way that you can tear it apart and put it back together so you can understand the underlying fabric of the passage. And then, and only then, question by question, just like we did in LR, what's the question stem? What are they asking me for? Let me go back to the passage. Let me predict my answer. I'm going to point to the line number where I found that answer. I'm going to anticipate what I believe should be in the correct answer, and then and only then do I go to the answer choices and find it. And then one by one, this is my answer, here are its merits, here are the reasons why these other four are wrong, and that you can explicitly document why is A wrong, why is B wrong, right? And why is C right. Blind review has to be deeply, deeply thorough. And the reason is that ultimately you get to strategy planning, and that's the time to inform your intuition. You want to change the way you've been reading for the last 20 years plus? We do it by analyzing our own work. Why was it that in my first read I didn't see it this way? What words did I miss? What structural cues did I miss to understand what the author was trying to communicate to me? So that you can better manipulate your intuitive approach into one that will work better for you in a time setting the next time around. And so when you do this mastery approach in strategy planning and you change those wrong answers into right answers, the real key in reading comp is what was missing from the passage that would have to have been there in order for that to be the right answer. What would the passage have to look like for that to be my right answer? And why is that not what I see in front of me? So this is what the 3 reviews look like. I'm not keeping up with the chat here. Any questions on this front?
This is where I find that my students are most likely to cheat. Like just this morning, I had a student tell me he hadn't done blind review for RC yet, but he got, 4 wrong or whatever it was. And it was like, well, you can't know that if you're doing blind review correctly, because the fact that he knows that has now tainted the way that he will review the section, because he will remember that certain questions troubled him. He'll know that he got 4 wrong, and so he's going to try to pick 4 questions to change his answers to. That's the wrong way to think about it. What he should be doing is trying to think about, this totally blind approach where how do I find the correct answer from scratch with no hint about how many I've missed or how successful or unsuccessful the section has been. And that process is what finally teaches you where the right answers are, how to find them, and also convinces you that some of them are just obscure and virtually unanswerable without a lot of time or a little bit of luck in finding the right part of the text quickly.
Yeah. And all the more reason that we want you to work on some of the analytical techniques around reading comp. And this isn't around reading. This is around what we do in blind review in order to better help us under timed conditions intuit some of these things. Because there's not enough time to do the kind of analysis that you need to do to ensure you get every question right. There just isn't time in 35 minutes. Nobody does it in 15 minutes. You can't get through 4 passages that way. Games in LR, there are some deep efficiencies. That's not here. Here, to really ensure those obscure ones, you need to dive deep in and find the language. And sometimes it's as small as a word or 2. But the better you can be about the way that you go about reading in blind review, the more that creeps into your practice every day, the way it creeps into the way you read everything. And then that will ultimately inform the way you do it, your timed version the next time around. So this is the core concept, and this doesn't change. This is true no matter what you do. And this circles back to what we talked about in games and what we talked about in LR last week, which is that the secret to this test is really the secret to great reading and great analysis now and when you go to law school and you have hundreds or thousands of pages to read. You have to be able to quickly paraphrase what you've read into something understandable and memorable for you. If you can't do that, you're never going to hold on to the information. There's too much there coming at you too quickly, and it's not going to anchor. You're going to lose it because there are too many pieces of information to remember. So it is critical that you analyze and paraphrase as you go. What did I just read? Was it argumentative or informational? If it was argumentative, underline the conclusion. In this case, that means claim, right? What are they claiming is true in this paragraph? Then take all of the rest of the evidence, analyze and incorporate it into a 7-word summary of that paragraph. And it's the practice of doing that 7-word summary that helps you get better at incorporating every piece of it. It's not just taking the conclusion and cutting it down to 7 words. That's not enough. You have to be able to rope in the direct evidence. You have to be able to rope in the context of that claim in order to make sure that it makes sense on its own. All of the referential nouns, all of the things that are vague about the conclusion statement itself, you need to make those unvague. I know that's not a word, but you know what I mean. In your 7-word summary, so that if you were to slap it on the headline of a newspaper, people would know exactly what that paragraph was about. If it's informational, make sure you synthesize what's there tie it all together into some form of topic sentence. And there were 1 or 2 paragraphs on this section that were really purely informational. Here's what this is about, and here are all the details. And that means that there will be one general sentence which encompasses everything, but again, it won't be specific enough for it to be really memorable and meaningful when you need it most. So make sure you're incorporating the most salient points of content into that 7-word summary before you move on. And paragraph by paragraph, there should be a quick summary for yourself. The more you practice the game at home, the more you practice it in blind review, the better you get at it in the moment. It shouldn't be something that you write down. It shouldn't be something that you struggle over. It should be in the moment. Here it is. Let me weave it together, paragraph by paragraph. They all sum up into one nice 15 or 20 second summary by the time you get to the end of the passage. Paragraph 1 did this, and then paragraph 2 did this, and then paragraph 3 they did this. And then you get to the end and you have yourself a little summary of the whole passage. That is the game. And it should be the game timed, and it should certainly be the game blind. Except blind, then you circle back and do it for real. And get deeper and deeper and deeper until you make it as specific and beautiful and perfect as you can.
This exercise is incredibly difficult and truly is like one of the fundamental building blocks on RC. I have students who are really good at RC, will miss fewer than 5 per section, and yet when it comes down to comparing our main points and the way we've paraphrased it and the way we've tied in supporting points or points from other paragraphs, I mean, it's just light and day. So there's a lot of improvement to be made by focusing on your own ability to interpret and articulate and not just answer the questions. Now, obviously, answering the questions is the final goal, but how do you get better at doing that? You test yourself along the way with these checks, particularly during blind review, so that the process becomes more automatic for your time testing.
And that's why I say in blind review, your goal shouldn't be getting all the right answers to the questions. Like, of course, that's what we want, right? But if all you're worried about is it right or is it wrong, you're not going to be making best use of all of the information that's there for you in that question. It's not only about what the right answer is. There are questions on this section that I knew the right answer, but I didn't really look at any of the wrong answers and didn't really analyze them and didn't see why they were wrong. And that's just as important, because you don't know what the next one's going to look like.
Right. If you know the right answer to a question and you get it right quickly timed, you didn't need the details of the wrong answers to help you, but you might need to recognize those patterns for a future question where you don't know the right answer so easily. Or it might work the other way. Maybe there's a question where you use process of elimination, you get it right, but there might be another question where the answers aren't so easy to eliminate and you really need a more affirmative approach where you can sort of predict the answer. So on blind review is where you start to work out those skills. How do I go back, look at this passage and be more inferential? Or how do I justify my answers with the text more concretely instead of going with my gut? And the more you do that, the more committed you'll be to your answers. On your time testing, I mean.
Yeah.
So Jacob, you mentioned like pre-phrasing like we do on LR, but I feel like there are only certain questions on RC that allow you to do this. Like the ones that say like, what do you think this phrase is saying? And then going back and reading it and understanding the concept, and the ones with the main points. But like, you can't do that on ones where it's like, what do you think the author would infer or agree with, right?
No,
If
you
it's-
can.
You can.
Because
Now
they're
look,
not asking you to read his mind. I'll let Jake fill in the blanks, but everybody believes that they want you to get in the author's mind, figure him out. The only thing you know about the author is what was in the text. It's a trick question. What's in the passage is what it really means.
Yeah, I think there are I would flip your question on its head. I would say there are certain questions for which it's really challenging. But I would say the majority of questions you can prephrase something. It may not, and it falls in line exactly with what we said about LR. It's not what it'll say, but it's what it'll do.
Okay.
Right? So, both, if you've got the comparatives are a little different, right? But it's sort of the difference between the question that says, with which of the following would the author be most likely to agree? That will be challenging, but you can at least spend 10 minutes reminding yourself what the author said, what the
Main
author's
points at
point
least.
was. Yeah, go back over your main points. What did he believes this, this, and this. It's easier when they say, with which of the following would this character from the passage agree? Well, how many things did that character from the passage actually say? Not much. How much is attributed to that person? Not much. Well, that's not so bad at all. And then as soon as they give you content, with which of the following would the concerning blah, 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 would the author be most likely to agree? Great. I can go back and see what the author said about that thing and then prephrase what does he believe about that thing. It's way better having something in hand because at least you've done analysis. It might not be perfect, you might not nail it, but it's better than going in blind, because otherwise you're going to fall victim to all the ways that they're going to try to trick you with answers that sound good but have the wrong stuff.
Or you just get caught up in the time trap of the process of trying to brute force it. So what I do on those questions, what does the author agree with? I take a quick check of my 3 or 4 main points and I look for those, my shallow dip into the answer choices. And like 3 out of 4 times, I find it. There's 1 out of 4 of those questions where I don't find a main point and I'm like, crap. That means that the answer is buried somewhere and I'm not sure where. But once I've read all the answer choices, I'll usually eliminate 1 or 2. Now, I may not know precisely where to go, but I have a couple leads. I know what the answer choices say. So I work them systematically. Is there low-hanging fruit, something easy? No. Okay, now I'll get a little deeper and say, do I remember any of these things from the answer choices? Can I find them quickly, to check 1 or 2 of those? But the one thing I don't want to do is just brute force, look at every single answer choice independently and go back to the passage and look them all up. That's going to take forever.
And actually, we're going to do a bit of this on passage. I picked out 3 questions from passage 1 to base solely on my 7-word summaries. And what's interesting, I only did the first 3, but now I'm looking at the rest of them. And question 6 also falls into questions 4 and 5. It's a little tough. And question 7 is a direct line reference, so you don't really need it. But 4 of the 7 questions are answerable just from my main points.
You know what's interesting about that, Jake? I was working on the LR tables today for the product we've been talking about. And one thing I did just out of curiosity, I took a whole section worth of these argument tables. I took just these really contrived articulations of the flaw where all I did was take one phrase from one part of the argument and say, okay, that phrase was, equivocated with this other phrase from the argument. Literally every single argument, I just chose phrases that I thought they had kind of equivocated with respect to, or where the error had occurred. I could answer like 20 of the questions with just that. Mm-hmm. No pre-phrase, nothing sophisticated, literally just identifying which 2 phrases in the argument sort of comprise the biggest gap, the most glaring error of the argument. The only ones where it didn't work well was the causal ones. You need a little more sophisticated framework there. But 20 out of the 26 questions, I could justify the correct answer with this completely contrived articulation of the flaw, which was like they assumed that this phrase meant that phrase.
Yep. Yeah. No, 100%. Look,
I was shocked.
I'm not shocked anymore, right? Like this goes back to the thing we were, you guys are all probably too young to remember when the SAT had analogies, but the analogy section on the SAT was, the idea was that they would give you 2 words and they would compare them, and they would ask you which of the following comparisons is the same kind of comparison. Keyboard is to computer as, and then you would have to find another thing where
I remember that, Jake.
Okay, Helen remembers. So the thing about the analogies was that what it came down to was something so deeply stupid and formulaic. All you had to do was say the first word means something involving the second word. Keyboard means a thing that you use to control the computer. And then the right answer was, I don't know what it would have been. But, the formula was so straightforward and so simplistic that nobody believed it worked. And I said, no, try it. Because if you do it, one of three things will happen. Either you'll nail it, right? Or your definition will be too general and two things will fit it, in which case get a little more specific. Or your definition is a little too specific, get a little more general, and then one will get encompassed by it. And it worked every time. As long as you knew the words, you were golden. And the same thing is true of that, and the same thing is true here. If you can headline each of your paragraphs, it's not identifying the topic sentence. It's different from that. Because the headline is not just the topic sentence. It's the topic sentence sort of informed by the reasoning into something elegant and memorable. But if you can do it and do it well, it makes answering the question so easy. Or at least it should.
Easier.
Easier. Okay. So I'm going to pop open. I'm going to reshare my screen here. Here's passage 1. Okay. This was my annotation of passage 1. And you can see it's really thin, right? I've got some things underlined, right? Those things are what I considered to be main points. You can notice in paragraphs 1 and 3, I actually underlined 2 things because I thought they sort of encompassed together the claim in each of those. And I've got a bunch of transition words highlighted, right? Including that question mark up at the top, because I always find questions to be powerful, so I did that. So if we take a look at these, I just want to practice 7-word summaries with you guys quickly, right? First paragraph, I've got 2 things underlined. Which works should be exhibited together? The aim is to select a series of works with something in common. Okay. But in the context of everything else, I wanted a little more information than that. Can somebody come up with a good one for me? Oh no. Sorry.
7-word summary for paragraph 1 is what we want.
Yeah.
Put them in the chat if you want. This is the one paragraph where we kind of went a different way, Jake.
Oh, interesting.
Because what I normally do is, if I find the first paragraph to be confusing, what I'll do is I'll withhold judgment. I'll see, well, what does paragraph 2 have to offer, particularly where it begins? And the beginning of paragraph 2 was specifically about the last sentence of paragraph 1. These the
retrospectives?
Yeah, the retrospectives, but it is also about the sentence you underlined, collecting the similar.
Yeah.
So sentence 1 of paragraph 2 tags a couple concepts from paragraph 1. It's not as helpful. Usually, whatever that first sentence of paragraph 2 is about, I'm like, oh, okay, well, there's what was important in paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 was hard on this one.
Who's got one? Anyone want to give it a shot? There's no right answer here.
Ultimately, Abigail, that's what you want. You want to take all of your 7-word summaries and combine them into one master summary, 7 words for the whole passage. But I find it useful to do it in steps. I can't go from 400 words to 7. I have to go from 400 to 25, then down to 7.
Yeah. And I think 7 for the whole passage is probably pushing it, right? If you've got 4 paragraphs, each with 7 words, 20 for the entire thing is probably okay.
Yeah, that's fair.
15, 20. Art is exhibited in collections and may be done with cinema as well. Good. Now, Isabel, that is not 7. Try again and make it 7.
I didn't know it needed to be exactly 7 words.
7's the max.
New York Post. Yeah. Only 7. That's all you get.
That's what makes this exercise intellectually challenging. If you could literally just restate the main point sentence, it wouldn't be hard. It wouldn't be worth doing. The reason it's hard is because you have to make difficult decisions about what is more important than what's essential and what can go. And just thinking about that means you're analyzing and interpreting the paragraph. You don't even have to be right, but you have to make a decision. That's the important part.
Helen, I like yours. It is 8 words, but you did one that was pretty similar to mine. Art with common characteristics can be displayed together.
And that kicks out the answer that I got wrong initially because I incorporated the art as part of the main point and it's not. So when I did the main point for the first one, I said like it was the one that said maybe
Right.
it's not best suited.
Yeah. Okay. So what about paragraph 2? Anyone want to take a shot at this one? That's nice, Abby. I like that. Collecting the similar, inadequate for nonfiction films.
Good.
I did something really similar but with less sophisticated language. I like it. And paragraph 3. Anybody? Anybody feeling brave?
Hold on, I'm trying to get it to 7 words.
It's
So
hard.
I
It's hard.
know.
It's hard.
When I tell students about this, they're like, yeah, that's dumb. And I'm like, some of the smartest people I know have a tough time with this. So,
Abby, I like yours. Film remakes throwing authenticity to the wind. Like it, very
Yeah.
poetic. That's good. You're not far off from where I was. That's where I ended up. And I want to point out, and this is something that Keith pressed on early, and I've adopted. I really like using punctuation, right? If you think of yourself as a copy editor, right, and you're trying to write really creative headlines for bad supermarket magazines and newspapers, you don't have a lot of room, so you can say a lot with a colon, with a semicolon, with a question mark, right? With a slash. There's a lot of ways that you can sort of express yourself in different ways. So make sure you're using punctuation to your advantage. Okay, so
What's not bad, Keith?
your suggestion there, I just think that film production is perhaps not the right scope, but authenticity sometimes put aside, I thought was perfect.
Well, I had to find 3 more words.
Yeah, but I don't think those are the right ones. It's not just
Okay,
film
well, I was
production.
under pressure
Okay, understood.
and I didn't get extended time.
So Helen, one of the things you can do, right? You take a look at your verb phrase. You've got put aside. It's a 2-word verb phrase. Choose a single word verb, and that gives you a little more flexibility on the other side. And it's not about film production in general, right? It's about early film retrospectives. So we want to be careful that we're accurate with regard to the scope.
One of the things I do when I'm looking for main points and when I'm paraphrasing main points is I'm always cognizant of the other main points. It's harder to do that going forward, but you guys heard me say earlier that if I find paragraph 1 to be challenging, sometimes I'll kind of hold off on picking the main point of paragraph 1 until I've at least begun paragraph 2. But certainly for the later paragraphs, everything I do is informed by what I think the earlier main points were and how they connect. So for paragraph 3 to be about something entirely different from paragraphs 1 and 2, that would be weird.
Yeah.
It should be about early film something.
Yeah.
Retrospectives is the theme.
Notice what I did in terms of the overlaps, right? First one, how to show art, collecting the similar. Second one, shares something with the first one. Collecting the similar is bad for early film. And then the third one shares something with the second one. Early film retrospectives are inauthentic, ignoring programming. Now I can take these 3 and analyze it as its own little LR stimulus. Right? Which of these 3 is the overall claim? What do you think? If this were an LR, which would be the claim? Number 2, absolutely, Isabel. Number 2 is the claim, right? And it's supported by the evidence in paragraph 3. Paragraph 1 is context.
I think there are kind of two different main point questions. There are some where the answers are very long and they are essentially a summary of each of your main points, 3 or 4 clauses. But then there's other ones where the answer choices are shorter and you're sort of forced to make that decision that Isabel just made. Which of the main points is at the top of the pyramid in terms of the support structure? And that's where you can do the macro LR analysis. You look at each main point and think about how do those interact and relate? How do those support each other? What if that was a separate LR stimulus? Which of those would be the conclusion? And so I think she's got it right. It's paragraph 2 that's articulating the conclusion of the whole piece.
Well, and then you have to get into the mind of the person who wrote this thing, right? If we go backwards here, why is that first paragraph there? Does it serve the main point of the passage? Or is it simply context? Does it give me anything for my main
Isn't
point?
it context?
Yeah, it's context. Right? We need to define our terms. What do we mean by collecting the similar, right? When we're thinking about what a retrospective is, we want to give some sense about, why would we even consider this? But the point that's being made by the author is paragraph 2 supported by paragraph 3. Just as in an LR, you can say, scientists often believe blah, 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 blah. However, scientist X believes the following, and here's why. That first sentence doesn't play a role in the actual argument of scientist X. Instead, it's there as context to give you a sense of what we're fighting against. But the point being made is in paragraph 2, and the support for that point, the support for that claim, is in paragraph 3. Which means if I'm asked a main point question here, what am I looking at? What is the main point? The main point is paragraph 2 because of paragraph 3, despite paragraph 1. Right? And the despite paragraph 1, unnecessary. It might be there, you might have it, but the core of this is the overall claim. So are you guys comfy with the right answer here? Or are people still angry about it? Is there an answer choice that you say, yeah, but this one also kind of says it?
I said B, both timed and untimed.
Okay. The practices that are best suited to exhibiting works in an artistic medium like painting are not well suited for exhibiting cinematic works. Okay. So there are 2 ways we can look at this. We'll come back to the way we have been doing prior. Actually, no, let's do that first, and then I'm going to do the other way. Okay. How much of the passage is dedicated to the practices best suited to exhibiting painting?
Just the first paragraph?
Just the first paragraph. And the fact that they aren't well suited for exhibiting cinematic works hints at paragraph 2, but kind of stops there. Right? So here's the other look at this, which I think helps. Let's look at this grammatically. What is the main subject noun of answer choice B?
The main subject?
Yeah, what's
Yeah.
the subject? And
What is the
main
subject
noun
noun,
in there?
of answer choice B?
Practices.
The practices. Good. And those practices are which ones? Which practices?
Wasn't it
Seeing the
collecting art?
Yeah, the
Collecting the
collecting of the
similar.
similar. Right.
Similar, yeah.
Is the collecting of the similar the subject of this passage?
Yeah.
What would you consider the main subject of this passage? Let's go back. What is the thing we are talking about in this passage? Is it all the ways that we collect the similar?
Wasn't it like looking for what it had in common?
That's what collecting the similar is.
Right.
But what is the thing we are analyzing in this passage about film? It's not collecting the similar.
Is it authenticity?
It's the retrospectives themselves.
Right.
It's not the concept of collecting the similar that we're worried about. It's the retrospectives. The concept of collecting the similar is much broader than the retrospectives in particular. We're concerned with the fact that the retrospectives are bad practice in film, not that collecting the similar is a bad practice for film. We want to talk about the retrospectives themselves because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the concept broadly. The focus of the passage is not collecting the similar. It's retrospectives that are an example of it, and they're the wrong thing. Take a look at the right answer. The right answer, answer choice A, what is the subject of that answer?
The screenings?
The screenings. Those screenings consisting entirely of early nonfiction films. Those retrospectives. Those things that we analyze throughout paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. It is a really subtle difference here. But we spend all of paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 talking about these retrospectives of nonfiction films, not about the practice in general of collecting the similar. We want to focus on the thing that is focused on, which is the retrospectives themselves. And in that way, when people talk about, it's not broad enough, it only talks about the stuff in paragraph 1. Answer choice B only talks about the stuff in paragraph 1 because collecting the similar is only referred to in paragraph 1. The rest of it, we're focused on film. That was the generality, and now we're narrowing.
So I have a question once the word retrospect was brought up.
Yeah, sure.
I'll look words up in LR and RC when I'm doing blind review, but and a lot of the time in RC, there will be a passage where there are a lot of words that I'm just not going to understand, and it really inhibits my understanding of it.
Yeah.
Is there, besides like context clues, is there a better way you can kind of...
I mean, look, you can look at the root of the word, right? Spective, like perspective, means what you see, and retro means backward.
But here's the other thing. I didn't know what it meant when I did this passage cold, but I noticed the word and realized I didn't know what it meant. So I knew they were talking about some kind of exhibition and that was the main point of the essay. I didn't just gloss over it and say, well, I don't know that, so forget it. I stopped for a moment and said, wait, I don't know that. What is it? And the context that I was able to elucidate is this is a way of displaying film. Now, I didn't know that it specifically meant a particular, artist's film, but that's implied by this idea of collecting the similar. That was an example that they gave in paragraph 1. Maybe you just take all the paintings of one painter and put them together. So I had all of the context necessary as long as I stopped long enough to recognize, hey, this is something. This word means something, and it has to be consistent with a film exhibition. And then I didn't need to know the exact meaning of it. But afterward, that's the first thing I did is I looked it up because I thought, what the hell is a retrospective?
Yeah, I would say certainly, given the first time it shows up in line 17, right? It's in reference to the sentence right before it, which was involving collecting together and screening several examples of the work of a particular person or studio, right? So in that way, if this is the first time some notable retrospectives, this is in reference to what they just described. It's got to be that thing. If I don't know the word, I'm going to presume it's a synonym. And so in this case, what we're talking about is not generally collecting artworks. What we're talking about is film retrospectives, film collections in this way, and why they aren't good. That's the thing we're actually talking about.
I kind of interpreted it like a film festival, basically. We're all going to get together and watch a bunch of stuff, like a museum for film.
Yeah, I mean, really what we're talking about is like, hey, it's Steven Spielberg's 75th birthday. There's going to be a 2-hour retrospective on HBO where they go through his entire body of work.
Mm-hmm.
That's what a retrospective is. We're looking backwards in time to see all the stuff that this person or this artist or this, time
Jacob,
period was.
actually, from as an English teacher, what you said is exactly what you have to do. You have to pick the word apart, and you have to look at the word retro. Everybody knows what that means.
Yeah, but the truth is that if you haven't taken Latin, or if you haven't done a lot of etymological study, right, it's
True.
really hard to look at a new word and be able, like, the reason I know to pick it apart like that is because I already know what it means, so I have confirmation of the fact that I've done it right.
Right.
It's a challenge when it's a new word, right? How do we know the word elucidate actually means to shed light on, right? You need to have studied Latin. You need to know that luce comes from lux, and right, like all of this
Means
stuff.
light, right?
Yeah. So look, you can try, but sometimes it doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, we have to use the context clue. There is no good. Isabel, what you're doing now by looking up those words is the right thing to do. It's the only way to learn new vocabulary is to look it up.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll never get there. All right, so there we were in question 1. But if we go on, oh come on, I don't remember a thing. If we go on to question 2 here, according to the passage, which of the following is true of early nonfiction films? Here's my point about this one. I look at my 3 paragraphs. I don't remember the answer. I can't know the answer because I don't know what they're referring to. They say a lot of things about early nonfiction films. But I know where to go. Because it's not going to be in paragraph 1. It's probably going to be in paragraph 2 or paragraph 3. And so I know where to go back to look for it. And in fact, if I look at my 7-word summaries, I can see the answer is already there. Because in paragraph 3, my 7-word summary incorporated not just the thing that I picked out as the claim, but a little bit of the context as well. And guess what I put in there? I put ignoring programming. And I remembered what I meant by that, right? That early film, those nonfiction films were put as prequel, like as what do they call those? Pre-reels for regular fiction films. So I already knew that those things were curated into nights at the theater. It was already there in my mind because I had incorporated it into my analysis. So I already knew, but I wanted to be sure that I double checked.
These are like Super Bowl commercials. You don't watch them without the Super Bowl.
Right.
That's what they're getting at, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
They might be artistic, but you don't watch them outside of that context is the whole point.
It was like you got the newsreel, and then you got a little bit of some propaganda from the army, and then you got
from the war.
Yeah, exactly, from the war. Yeah, exactly.
So I picked the right answer, but I thought that this one you needed to stretch and infer a little bit, because if you go back to the right sentence, it doesn't say specifically that they were intended, which is why I didn't love this one. It just says that they have been supporting films. So I didn't know what their intentions were, but that I liked this answer a little bit better than C.
Okay. So Abby's right? If you go back to line 27, with some exceptions, nonfiction films have always been supporting films, not main attractions. Have always been.
That's a tough coincidence if it always happens that way. Tough to say that's not intentional when it's uniform.
Okay, so I missed that word.
Yeah, and not just always, but as opposed to main attractions. So if they weren't main, they must have been supporting. And C, the problem, you said you answered C?
No, I chose D, but if I was choosing between the two.
Heavily influenced. They never qualified how much influence there was. So it's impossible to know. Any other questions on this one? Okay. Having done that, you go to question 3. The author would be most likely to reject which of the following principles, right? One by one, I can see that most of these are supported by my 3 paragraphs. Works of art should be presented as authentically as possible, right? Paragraph 3, he's upset about inauthenticity, so he likes that. Dissimilar works of art should never be displayed together. Didn't he just say he liked programming? And that nonfiction works shouldn't be put together? That they should be mixed up with other things? So that feels like that's not a thing that's supported by my 3 paragraphs here, right? Programming. That's what I meant by programming. I had to think about what I meant by programming, but that was the thing. And so it was there for me in my 3 paragraph summaries. The fact that I incorporated the word programming, and I didn't know ahead of time, but I called that out. The programming was important. It turned out to inform 2 answers. So that's where I got with my 7-word summaries, and I think they ended up being really helpful. And I don't know whether these are word for word what I did the first time I read it, but they're close enough for art, and that was definitely paragraph 3, having that bit about programming was critical. So for me, making sure that you do a good job in your 7-word analysis, not just summarizing the claim, but incorporating the entirety of the paragraph into that headline. Incorporating the evidence is really critical. Make sure you get the sense of the thing. Any other questions on paragraph 1, or we want to move on to passage 2? Cool. All right. Keith, you're up.
So I did a annotated version of this showing you what mine looks like on a time test. I underline main points and highlight the transition words, and I do it with complete recognition that it costs me some time because the tools are not terrific. And I make a few sacrifices. There are a few things I sometimes want to annotate, but I can't because the highlighting feature isn't very forgiving. If it's for example, the word I, a single letter is hard to highlight. So I try to keep my annotations really sparse. I underline the main points, highlight the transition language, and that is enough to give me a roadmap of the entire passage. I know where all of the landing points are, all of the main points, but also if they ask me about something else, I can see what are the transitions between the main point and that other thing they're asking me about. And that will often reveal the correct answer to me, the presence of however, or for example, in between the main point and whatever sentence they're asking me to analyze. The other thing that I did here on the right is I did the 7-word summary. I just took a stab at a 7-word summary for each paragraph. And for the sake of time, we're just showing them to you, but this is really the kind of work that you should be doing on blind review to make sure that you not only read and understand the paragraph, but then learn to make decisions about priority, which ideas were the most important, the most supported. It's no different than the decisions you make on LR. Which ideas is the conclusion? Now, how do I pin that down to a sharp paraphrase? If it's an informational paragraph, what's the inference? What must be true given that? And how do I pare that down to a sharp prediction of the answer? That's what we're trying to derive here. So I'll give you guys a minute to look at the summaries that I came up with. And if you want to ask any questions about them, feel free. But otherwise, I really want to talk about the main point question for a minute and see if you guys have difficulties with that. Because what I noticed is that the main point, the correct answer, basically takes all 4 of my points here and just repackages them using a few paraphrases and a few direct quotes as well. All right, so what do you guys think? Do you want to ask questions about the main points or move on to question 8? All right, let's move on. So here's our main point question for passage 2. I should have made that a little bigger. Pull up question 8 if you can't read it. The correct answer is C. And I want to go through it and just show you guys how strongly it overlaps with my prephrases here. It says, though the ILC's draft articles are a worthwhile attempt to assemble an appropriate set of principles. Notice my third bullet point here. Draft articles are forward thinking. Worthwhile attempt is their paraphrase there. And then attempt to assemble an appropriate set of principles. Look at my bullet point for paragraph 2. Draft articles prescribe broad precepts for treaties. What is a precept? It's a principle. So in the first clause of answer choice C, we have paraphrased 2 of my bullet points already. So these are principles, back to answer choice C, to govern the formulation of treaties concerning the use of international water courses. That's almost a direct quote of my bullet point 1. ILC developed treaty structure for international water courses. So again, we have very strong overlap between the main points and the correct answer. And then continuing after the comma in answer choice C, they are flawed. That's bullet point 3, but inadequate, because their lack of provision for the foreseeable effects of certain predicted environmental changes. They don't provide for foreseeable environmental changes. That's bullet point 4. They are too inflexible for what changes are they talking about? Large river flow fluctuations was the specific type of change that the passage dealt with. So you can see a couple clever paraphrases make C less than obvious, but the contents, you know, are strongly overlap with the main points that I identified here. So we can talk about number 13, but before we do, I want to make sure that there is no more confusion about question number 8. Were there other answer choices that you guys want to talk about before we move on to question 13? Everyone's good with number 8? I didn't think this was, I thought passage 1 and 3 had very difficult main point questions. I thought this one was easier. So we'll come back to the main point question on passage 3. Let's take a look at question 13. I don't have a slide for it. I didn't know which questions you guys would have trouble with. And Jake and I really wanted to talk about the main point questions tonight. So we set up all 3 of those, and then we figured we'd let you guys tell us where your difficulties were. So question 13 says, the passage most strongly suggests that which one of the following was true at the time the ILC began developing the draft articles. Before we look at the answer choices, where are we likely to find the answer to that? Which paragraph, if we just had to guess, given our 4 main points? This is about the time the ILC began developing. Any thoughts? Yeah, I would think maybe 1, possibly 2. But I think you guys are right to start to favor the beginning before the criticism. We're talking about the development early in the, right, first paragraph, beginning of the second paragraph, right? All right, so Liz, you had trouble with number 13. What I thought was interesting about it was that having attended law school, the answer to number 13 was something that jumped out at me when I read this. It's a matter of sort of context. What are you familiar with? What resonates with you? But at the beginning of paragraph 2, they told us that this draft was an attempt to codify the customary principles that are manifested in past legal decisions and currently accepted in international practice. They specifically told us that this was an attempt to codify decisions that had already been made. It wasn't an attempt to do something new. They were trying to articulate what had already been done and standardize it. And having gone to law school, I just know that that's a very common thing to do. The entire restatement series is an attempt to do exactly that, to take the common law, the cases that have been decided, and generalize them, re-articulate them, restate them. That's what they're doing here. They've made a restatement of international law regarding non-navigational water courses. In other words, waterways that ships don't go down is the simplification for that. Small waterways. Smaller anyway. So so there's our justification for answer choice C. That's already been articulated by courts, and they just codified it in the draft articles. What were the tricky answer choices, or was it just tricky to find the justification for E?
Now that you mention it, I think it's really obvious, but I chose answer C the first time around. Existing treaties governing water rights rarely covered matters involving environmental protection.
What made you like that? Let me ask you this, because I can see the appeal of it, but I can also tell you why it's wrong.
I liked it because it said they rarely covered matters involving environmental protection, and I felt like the author was specifically focusing on the fact that they lacked that.
Sure. Why would we need draft articles? This is why I think C might be tempting. Why would we need these draft articles if the existing treaties already cover this? What's the answer to that? Because he does say so. He hints at, he tells us, why do we need this? And it's not because there aren't any treaties. We're not, this doesn't exist. It's a different problem that he's addressing here.
That it doesn't address climate change.
Yeah, there may be treaties, but they're not up to the task, right? They don't give us the kind of international cooperation that we need to manage the riverways. In other words, there may be treaties, they just might be sort of simplistic and inadequate to deal with all of this. So we don't really know. You could be right. I mean, the answer you're picking could be consistent with the passage, but there are other reasons why they may have drafted the articles other than just people weren't making the treaty. To me, it seems like they were making treaties, and what these draft articles were about was standardizing the process, making sure that the treaties that are made contain the right stuff. Otherwise, why have draft articles unless people are willing to make a treaty? Why make a model form of this if countries aren't out there making treaties about this? So that was kind of some, context that I had, having seen these issues discussed in other scholarly literature. All right, other questions about passage 2, or do you want to jump in on that, Jake?
No, I mean, I think we're nailing it here. Hold on, I had a thought here. I think part of the problem with an answer like this is that what they're doing is they're pointing you to a particularly difficult piece of rhetoric to unpack, right? The idea of the attempt to codify the customary principles of international water law. That's a hard sentence to understand, and they're purposefully asking you a question about a difficult sentence to understand. The tendency for a lot of test takers is to read a sentence like that and say, well, I don't understand what that says. I'm just going to ignore it.
Forget it. Yeah.
Right. I'm
just
gonna
like
move past
retrospectives. Like,
and I'm just going to hope
it
doesn't factor in. Sometimes it won't. In this case, it did. And so we have to get better at least getting a general understanding of what they mean, right? If you don't understand the word codify, which, it is not a super common word, it's not in common usage, fine, then you go look it up after the fact. But we at least have to get the sense of what that sentence is saying to us. And certainly when you read this question stem, you know where they're pointing you at. You know that they're pointing you at the end of the first paragraph or the beginning of the second. You only have 2 or 3 sentences to look at. So rather than trying to shoehorn in one of the answers that doesn't really fit for you, but you understand it, maybe try sort of digging in a little harder on the rhetoric you don't understand to see if you can pull the meaning out of it.
Let me take one more stab, Liz, at eliminating C, and then I want to look at D for Abigail. The other problem with C, now that I look at it more carefully, is that the passage is about environmental changes. What are we going to do in response to environmental changes? What are we going to do to make sure everyone gets water? It's not about environmental protection. Those are obviously related issues, but the thing isn't how do we protect our water supplies? It's what are we going to do about the fact that our resources are dwindling? How do we allocate them well? How do we create treaties that treat everyone equitably given that the resource is being damaged? Not how do we protect the resource? Different perspective.
Yeah, I think when I was doing this, I just kind of interchangeably used protection and um, changes, but obviously that's not not correct and not helpful.
Right. So, okay, D, conflicts over the management of water resources had been escalating sharply. It said they could. If you go back and find it, it has increased the potential
Yeah.
for international conflict over
Yeah.
water resources, not actual conflict. I thought that that was a really hard answer choice. And I actually had to go back and find it because I was like, hey, I like two answers here.
Yeah, and I would say that that's a bit about, again, noticing what the noun is, right? It's not noticing that. Oh, now I don't. Now I've lost it again.
Escalating sharply is what answer choice D
No,
says.
from the passage, right? It said the potential for instead of actual conflict, right? The noun there is potential.
Yeah.
It's potential. There isn't
Increased
actual conflict.
potential for international conflict.
Yeah.
And
So
also
there isn't-
notice that conflict isn't the same as I guess yeah, it does use the same language, conflicts, but
Yeah, but
escalating sharply is not just increased potential. That's
right.
a particular qualification or description that would require an equally strong qualification or description in the passage.
And I want you to half forget that I'm about to say this, but I am going to say it, right? This is an answer choice that used a word from the passage, but then described it in an incorrect manner, right? There is conflict, right? There's conflict in the passage, there's conflict in the answer choice. But in the passage, it said that there was potential for the conflict, and in the answer choice, it said that the conflict was escalating sharply. Those are different. This is how they drag you into one of these answer choices. They use familiar vocabulary. I remember them saying conflict. I'm going to answer that.
It even gets worse now that I look at it. Escalating sharply in frequency and intensity. I mean, it's just out of control here.
Yeah. Yeah. But then the question is when you look at the question stem, the passage most strongly suggests that, right? It's not that it's possible. It's not that there's a hint. Most strongly suggests doesn't mean you have to make 10 leaps in deduction and massive assumptions. It should be there, or it should be one step away. We're not talking about 10 steps away. And this is 10 steps away.
There were at least two questions. I remember when I was reading the passage, I thought that first sentence of paragraph 2 was really interesting because I'm a law nut and I enjoy common law and how it's recorded and how it's made. And then it turned out there were at least two questions where that piece of information was either critical to answering the question or eliminating an answer choice. I remember it came up a few times and I was like, wow, that was really fortuitous to have noticed that, because I typically do not latch on to the details that way, Liz. So I don't want to give you the impression that I just always notice everything and that's how I approach the test. But on that question, I did happen to see it. And that's why I didn't want to give you an artificial canned response. I knew exactly which sentence had the support for it. And I knew it before my blind review. So blind review is often about teasing out when you have trouble with a question like that. Can I go back and find the sentence that supports the correct answer? And then can you take your correct answer and find what you thought supported it and see how they're actually different, like we did with 13. Okay, shall we move on?
Yeah. What's next here? Passage 3.
I thought that this passage was very difficult for a non-scientist.
I hated this passage because I suck at science.
And part of the problem really, okay, so the introductory paragraph is frequently, for me, the hardest paragraph to pin down the main point because it's often contextual and I don't know what context it's serving until I've read the passage. So I have to sometimes go back and amend paragraph 1. So I would say paragraph 1 for this passage is also somewhat contextual. And it wasn't perfectly clear to me which sentence to key in on. Paragraph 2, I found, was almost non-argumentative.
Yep.
My initial summary of it was that's just information. And it wasn't until I realized that I only had 2 main points, paragraph 1 and 2, and I wasn't even 100% sure about the main point to paragraph 1. That's when I decided I better come up with something for paragraph 2. So if they're going to explain all of this research to me, maybe I could just summarize like the end result, the final findings, and gloss over the details of how they got there. It seems to me if you are telling me a story about a research program, the final thing is the most important part of the research, not the beginning or the middle. That's how I came up with what I underlined in paragraph 2. Literally, I thought this is one big story. It's all information. And the end of the story matters a lot more than the beginning, because that's where we had the findings and what's the last word? The findings and what they developed. I mean, that was like the tangible results of the research. And then paragraph 3, I also found that to be almost non-argumentative. If there is an argument there, it's not supported. I mean, if there's an opinion there, it's not supported with any premise. So ultimately, I just found the sentence that I thought was the most opinionated, the most like least, the one that I could least support, or the one that I would need the most support to buy into. And I figured, well, that's got to be their claim. You know, if I'm trying to put this in the structure of a argument, I'm trying to force fit it, because I don't think paragraphs 2 or 3 were really arguments. But if I had to pick the main, most important thing about those paragraphs, I underlined the last 2 sentences of paragraph 2 and the first one of paragraph 3.
So
This one was tough.
This was tough. Here's what's interesting. I literally underlined completely different sentences on the entire passage from Keith. We both got all the right answers. It doesn't matter. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are some wrong ways to analyze, but there are a lot of good ways to analyze. There are a lot of good ways to see it, but you have to choose something. You can't just sit there passively and wait for the passage to come to you and wait for you to understand. You have to dig in and find something to anchor yourself with. I thought of it a totally different way, and it was okay. It got me where I needed to go. So understanding the passage based on what you believe is being communicated to you is okay, as long as you commit some structure to it. It'll work out for you.
All right, so let's look at the main point question, because I actually thought this one was pretty challenging. Number 16. If we look at the correct answer, C, it says Belcher and Hu's research on the abilities of some peptides to bind to semiconductor materials. That's bullet point 1, bullet point 3. Indicates that peptides might eventually be applied to the production of computer chips with transistors smaller than the lower limit set by current methods. Here's where I had some difficulty. That context was not captured in my main points. So for me, this was a much tougher one than passage 1 or passage 2 even, where there was a ton of overlap between my bullets and the main point. I have a lot of overlap between C, a substantial amount, enough to keep it in basically. And the other answer choices deviated enough for me to exclude them. But ultimately I was down to B and C, and I had to make a decision based kind of on degree, because I think that B and C are very similar to one another. So I'm curious to hear you all's opinions. What are the answer choices that you all picked for this? Are there any that you need an explanation for?
I also whittled it down to B and C.
And then you got it right?
Yes.
Well, how did you choose C over B?
I think it honestly just came down to me reading it and I was like, I like C better.
Yeah, I mean, that time test, that's how I do it. On blind review, that's not how I do it.
So
Blind,
this was kind of like the mistake I made in the first one and then corrected in my blind review. And then the first time I did this one, I picked B and then I changed it to C because the advances wasn't the main point.
there you go.
Whole science
Perfect,
stuff.
perfect way to get straight to the point. If we look at the subject of the sentence, more often than not, it should match with the main subject of the passage, which here is Belcher and who, not the advances in computer chip speed and efficiency beyond the year 2010. Now, that is part of the context. That's why we're talking about Belcher and who, but they are the main attraction here. They're the main story. They should be in the headline, front and center.
Yeah.
Not at the end, which says, oh, and by the way, they're included in this too. The most dismissive way possible to grammatically include them, a subordinate clause at the tail end of the sentence. There couldn't be a less important part of the sentence. So I used to find it very artificial to look at grammar, to pick an answer choice. I used to think that the content should really dictate it, but the grammar establishes priority. And it's not based on order. It's based on the independent versus dependent clauses. What is the main clause of the sentence? That should correspond with the main point of the passage. And the dependent clauses, whether they're before or after the main clause, those should describe the context and the supporting points. Now, I say should because Jake and I kind of talked about this before. I think that the LSAT writers are clever enough where they could flip the subject and predicate and still write a correct answer. So that wouldn't be my exclusive basis. I would only use that when I'm down to 2. And I think that the content is very similar for both. And it's a matter of degree. Which one prioritizes the right things? That's when I would start looking at which ideas are in the main clause of the sentence versus which ones are in the subordinate clauses.
And I, by the way, I'm getting more and more convinced that this is right, because if you take a look at I think there are 3 defensible, I shouldn't say defensible, there are 3 answer choices on this one that I think are reasonable to leave in upon your first pass. I think B is reasonable to leave in because it gets at a lot of it. But I think D is also reasonable to leave in on your first pass. Does anybody have a sense why I say that?
D, you said?
Yeah, I think D would be reasonable upon your first pass to leave it in.
It's
Here's
like
why.
the right stuff.
Yeah, it's
not
got all the right
inconsistent.
stuff. And who's the main subject? The main subject is the research again, right? It's centering the discovery of peptides, right? Which is the main subject of the whole passage. That's what you want the sentence to be about, and it's about it. It doesn't go far enough. It only talks about the first tiny bit of the research. It doesn't really get at the main point, right? But the truth is, you should be looking at 2 things, right? And the LSAT writers are looking at 2 things. They're looking at what the thing should do, and they're also looking at the grammar of the thing, who you're giving priority, who you're giving standing to, right? So they know if people are looking at grammatically, they're going to get it down to C and D. If they're looking from content, they're going to get it down to B and C. So they're trying to get you on both sides. It means they must be thinking about it. They must be thinking about the structure of their grammar. I certainly would if I were writing the questions. I certainly have. So, keep in mind when you're down to 2, take a look at who the subject is and ask yourself, is that the subject of this article, right? If you had to tell somebody, well, who's this article about? It's about their research. It's not about the computer chip speed. It's about the research. Yeah, Isabel?
When I was summarizing the paragraphs after I read each one, like similarly with the first one about the art, I feel like I always started with the beginning of the paragraph and concluded that that was more important than what was happening at like the end of the paragraph. So I guess I'm understanding that that's definitely not true.
It
Because
is.
I was like, I don't know if I want Belcher and Hugh to be important in this because they're not mentioned until the end of the first paragraph, but then the rest of the entire passage is about them.
Yeah, you have to treat it like an LR stimulus. You don't know what order the paragraph is going to be in, right? You have to be open to the idea that the main point's going to be at the beginning or the end. So, for instance, when I did the third paragraph, let me go back. That was it. So when I did the third paragraph, I actually sort of saw that last sentence at the bottom as my claim. It will take that kind of finesse. What kind of finesse? The kind of finesse that they displayed in their research at the nanoscale to produce self-assembling circuits. Right? That to me felt like sort of the point here, is that you're gonna have to be really clever to make this work, to make circuits out of this stuff.
See, I thought it was a sandwich paragraph. I think that's a rearticulation of sentence 1. What kind of finesse? We have to build these special little circuit building tools that can bind to organic compounds. And we don't quite have them yet. We're in the process.
Yeah,
and
I guess I took that last sentence as the claim only because the first sentence is, who says that in order to do it? Okay, fine, he does. Give me some evidence. Here's some evidence, and so here's my claim. Yep, he's right. Same. I mean, it's all the same stuff, right? But, Isabel, you really have to think about these paragraphs as being, they're malleable in so many ways in terms of their structure. You can restructure them any way you want as the writer, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody's putting together an RC passage that they take extant work, extant writing, and they say, this one's too straightforward in terms of its structure. I'm just going to rewrite a little bit, move things around, get them in a way that makes it a little obfuscated, a little less clear what's where. Otherwise, it would be simple. There are some passages that it is that way. Here's your main point: first sentence, first sentence, first sentence. But it's not always that way.
Here's what the benefit, I think, of focusing on the first sentence. Look at the language here. It says that we have to get a set of circuit building tools. And then look at the answer: specific circuit construction needs, circuit building tools, circuit construction needs. That was the essential connection that I thought, really sealed the deal for E. And it was strange because ordinarily when I am interpreting a referential pronoun, I go to the immediately preceding sentence, the daub of glue sentence. But that sentence has a referential pronoun they. And the previous sentence has a referential pronoun they. And the previous sentence has a referential pronoun the group. Everything points back to the first sentence, was my way of interpreting the structural language of that paragraph.
Yeah.
Yeah, for 17 on my time section, the first time around I chose B, and the second time around I chose D.
So what's wrong with B?
So my thinking of it was when I read that the kind of finesse, I was like, oh well, they're being very creative, like they had to kind of finesse it to like think of something new in a way. So that was my thought process when choosing B.
Yeah, that was what was good about B. What was bad about B?
The last sentence when it says other than DNA.
Yeah, this is not DNA research.
Yeah, it was on the peptides and stuff.
Peptides, right?
Yeah, it's not.
I think that's where like I definitely like lost myself because I was so confused between the DNA and peptides. I was like, what is this?
Right. And that's really hard, right? Because unless you have a really solid science background, the subtlety between peptides and DNA is hard, and they only explain it once. They
You know what
explain it
else?
At the end of the first paragraph, but that's it.
The other thing that I
also was in like DNA, like when I did take science classes, when they would talk about DNA, they would talk about like proteins and all that stuff. And I was like, oh, like maybe they're similar, but I can't rely on background knowledge in this test. And I keep forgetting to do that.
I think the other difficult thing about this passage is that they're describing a laboratory protocol that has become more and more important in cutting edge technology, where you're using molecular glue, like like antibodies, to stick to things, to identify them, to manipulate them, to react them, to protect them. It's a whole body of science right now, these antibody research, immunochemistry. We just did another passage on that last week,
Yeah.
immunochemistry passage from prep test 88. So that is modern technology in biology. And so it was very familiar to me to have small molecules that bind to others. I mean, the laboratory importance of that, I just can't even overstate it. Almost every protocol I know of depends on some kind of binding interaction between tiny molecules. So the importance of the binding aspect of it was really tangible to me. I imagine if you haven't done a lot of scientific research, you're like, who cares what it binds to? I can understand like not appreciating the significance of that.
So any other questions on this passage since we're here? No. Any other questions in general?
I put a slide for the comparative passages that we can do.
Oh, great.
I thought one question was really tricky. And it's tricky if you don't know what to do. The tone question, number 26. It's hard to say, what am I supposed to look up to know the tone of the passage? The content alone won't do it. And the summaries won't even do it, because you're purposely trying to strip away the parts that would tell you the tone. You're trying to simplify those so that there's almost no tone. So what I do when I'm asked about the tone is I go back and I look for two things. I look for the point of view. And that's something that I had never thought to look at until Jake pointed it out one time. There was a first person passage, and the reference to me, I mean, it might have been the first RC passage where they had ever done that, honestly, because these are usually really scholarly writings. And so if you notice, passage A has our, me, us, all these references to this collective first person. And then also, if we think about what is the level of technical jargon, those are the two things I look at, the point of view and the technical jargon. He uses the phrase mother tongue, which is like, could not be any less technical. The only part where he gets technical is in the third paragraph. He talks about grammatical genders. But then, in case you didn't know what he was talking about, many examples. Bridges are grammatically male in one language and female in another. And violins are the reverse. So you don't even really have to understand what the hell he means by grammatical gender, because you get the point by the end of the paragraph. It's clear that this wasn't written for scholars, where he's giving them a bunch of examples of this technical term. If these are scholars, they probably should know it, and they don't need all these examples. And then you contrast that with passage B. There isn't a single reference to first person, no us, me, we. Instead, every reference to people is subjects. And they even call it out in the question. They ask you, what do they mean by subjects? Because it's so peculiar to use that kind of third person reference throughout the whole passage. The subjects this, subjects that. When tested, they're talking about experimenting on the subjects. And then the technical jargon, the stimulus set, numerical reasoning, non-Worfian versus Worfian, numerical subjects, enumerate subjects. And all of those things were highly technical, and almost no definitions were given for any of them. The readers just expected to know what all of that stuff is. And then the one contrast that I thought was really interesting, look in passage A, paragraph 1, when he's trying to talk about something abstract. He says different pictures of reality on their speakers. In passage B, paragraph 2, he says concept of approximate numerical magnitude right? Pictures of reality is trying to simplify a very abstract idea. The other concept of approximate numerical magnitude is a way to make a simple idea abstract. He's going the opposite way. So there's the language that I think best justifies the answer to 26. And so if you're stuck on the tone or attitude questions, what I would say is focus on adjectives and adverbs, especially when they appear at the beginning of the sentence. Unfortunately, interestingly, those kind of tags are often important. I also look at the point of view. Are there any first person references? That's very non-scholarly and familiar to talk about yourself, or even worse, the reader. If you start saying you, then that's like the least formal that you can get. And then finally, what is the level of technical sophistication of the language? And when it is technical, is it explained or just left in its technical complexity? And so all that justifies answer choice A, that the author of passage A was for like, Popular Magazine. And then passage B, probably in some kind of scholarly journal where people would already be familiar with the concepts, and where it would be a lot more awkward to talk about us and we and you.
23 and 25. Sure. We don't have slides showing it, but let's talk about both passages are concerned with answering which of the following questions in 23. I found this question to be a little sneaky. You have to pay really careful attention to what the question is actually asking you, and then you have to take a look at the question stem. This question can be asked in two different ways. Sometimes they'll ask you the passage is primarily concerned with, and other times it just says they're concerned with answering which of the following questions. So in this case, if they're concerned with answering which of the following questions, Isabel, we were talking about prephrasing. Go prephrase. What's the question A is trying to answer?
The wharf person, his way of thinking that the language that you speak dictates your understanding is incorrect.
Yeah, the language you speak changes the way you see things. So does the language you speak and the way it talks about stuff change the way you see stuff? Okay, what about passage B? What question is it trying to answer?
It's more about like innate nonverbal cues for numbers.
Right, but what's the question? What question is he trying to answer?
Can you understand things without having a known language attached to it?
I like that.
Not bad. Look at sentence 1 if you want a real high level overview of passage B. The role of language in the development of numerical reasoning. What role does language play in developing your sense of numbers?
Okay. So now we take a look at B and C. How are they different? They're similar.
I like what you said first, because I interpreted this question as primarily. So what was the main thing? And I thought, well, research wasn't the main thing, but it was one thing that they both had in common.
Right. Okay. But I think there is a pretty subtle difference between what's in answer choice B and what's in answer choice C, right? B says, what does research tell you about the relationship between language and thought? And C says, do differences among language result from different ways of thinking about the world? What's different about them?
One is from different ways of thinking. One is between language and thought.
It flips the causal timing. It flips the causal direction. Does thought affect language, or does language affect thought? C asks whether thought affects language, and that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about whether language affects thought.
Mhm.
So you chose E, Abby. Is the influence of language on thought confined to specific areas such as... interesting. Okay. Do they ask that question in the passage?
It's sort of like neither passage is concerned about that, right?
Right.
You
They're
need both.
Yeah. They're content to talk about language, right? They're content to talk about number. They're not asking, hey, since this is true about language, or since it's true about number, is it true about everything? They don't. I want to know the answer to that, but the passages aren't asking that question.
I guess even with both, that we know that number and language are related, and we know that gender and language have some relationship, but neither of them says, and there's nothing else. That's the only relationship that exists.
Right. This is why pre-phrasing is really, anticipating answers is really important. You can ask yourself what the questions are in these passages. What questions does it ask? I mean, this is a bit about that IRAC analysis, right? Can you figure out what the issue?
Yeah.
Can you figure out the issue? What's the issue here? Why are we even writing this thing? Right? Whoever it is that's writing passage A about Benjamin Lee Whorf, why does he care? What question is he trying to answer? He's trying to answer whether language affects the way you see the world, whether gendered language changes the way you see the world. Cool. Yeah, and you know what's interesting about this one, Isabel, is that I actually didn't find it all that helpful on this one in terms of doing passage A first and then passage B. I got a bit down the road. It wasn't as helpful as in other ones, but it did help. So
I tend to know when it's not going to help. When the question explicitly says, what's the relationship between the two?
Sure.
You know, I don't even bother looking at it. So I knew that it was helpful for 23. I mean, I knew I could make progress on 23 without reading passage B. And I think that was actually the only one I attempted, because the rest of them were so focused on passage B. But it really helped me on 23 to not look at the answers that were, unique to passage B. I don't know if there were any, but usually there's a trap answer that's about B but not A. And those don't appeal to me because I look at the question before I read A.
Yeah. I had 26 down to 2. I had 26 down to A and C. But other than that, it wasn't really helpful. I think in 25, you can pre-phrase this as well. We know what they're asking, right? What are they asking when they say when they talk about the relationship between the two paragraphs, between the two passages? What do they actually want to know?
What's the first one saying and what's the second one saying?
How are they similar? How are they different?
Yeah.
That's what they want you to compare and contrast. How are they similar? How are they different? They both talk about language, but passage A does what and passage B does what different. Right? So I tried to think about what I thought was sort of the underlying difference between the two of them. What's really different about these two passages and their concepts? They're similar in a lot of ways, but there's something different about them. Do you feel like there's something like substantively different about these two ideas?
I think it goes back to what you said with language and thought.
Right. They're both about language and thought, for sure.
And A focuses more on like specific grammar structures. B focuses on like not having specific language for numbering.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I see is that when you look at passage A, in the third paragraph, when we get into sort of the meat of it, it says that grammatical genders can shape the feelings and associations that speakers have toward things, right? It's much more of like a, how do you feel about the thing that you're looking at or talking about? Whereas in passage B, it's something much more fundamental. Do you even know what 3 is? Right? It's not like, oh, I find bridges to be elegant as opposed to sturdy. It's like, do I know how to count stuff? And that seemed to be the big difference for me in terms of they're both talking about language and thought and understanding of the world, but this is A is much more subtle, B is much more fundamental, it felt like.
If feelings versus reasoning is the word that they keep using in passage B, does the language dictate how you reason about the world, whereas passage A's, does the language affect how you feel about the world?
Yeah. So I feel like, keeping an eye, when they ask you this question, this is really about like, what's sort of a fundamental difference between the two of them? They're not going to ask you what they treat the same. They're going to ask you the thing that they're both concerned with, how do they treat it differently? Are you comfy with the answer?
Yeah, I picked the right answer right the first time and then changed it. It was really just the way they phrased it, because basically one of them was the cause and like one of them was the effect, or they just changed the way that they put conceptual differences arising from concepts. So that messed me up a little bit because I didn't know exactly what they were trying to say.
What did you change it to? To B?
D. I went from E to D.
E to D.
Are you talking about 25, Isabel?
Yeah.
Okay, D.
Passage A portrays linguistic differences as arising from conceptual
Yeah,
differences.
you got it backward.
Yeah.
Whereas B from linguistic differences. Yeah.
It's the linguistics that change your conceptual, right, your concepts.
And both passages do that. Neither one flips it the other way. They both do it that way. The question is, what is the concept that's different? Any others, guys? All right.
Fun section.
Yeah.
I have office hours tomorrow at 8 Eastern. And I'm going to share the link here, and then Jake can send it out again tomorrow.
Yeah, and I'm gonna do office hours on Wednesday morning, I believe. I'm gonna double check. I haven't actually put it in yet. My phone decided to die last night, and I've been without a phone all day, and it's really disconcerting. Yeah, Wednesday morning I'm gonna do office hours at 10, and I'm gonna do LR, and I'm gonna work on the structures that we were talking about last week. We're going to try to apply these. We're going to drill it a little bit. So we can do some of the ones from 89, but I'll cherry pick some questions that I think are good examples of why this is so powerful, easy ones and hard ones, so that we can sort of work through them together and really get a sense for what it means to just organize premises, get everything in the right order, and what Keith was saying about articulating flaws, articulating gaps. God, it's powerful when you get good at it. I was telling the class in Pt89, the Pt89 section, LR section 2, it's like 22 of the 25 questions. If you were really, really facile with it and you really got through it quickly, it was like a minute a question. Maybe faster than that even. It just got so quick because you really didn't have to do much. And it left you time for the complicated ones. It left you time for the causal ones, which is what you really need, because those ones take a little more digging and a little more manipulation to get where you need to go. So LR for Wednesday. If you've got issues before then, let us know. Keith tomorrow at 8, me Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, and then we'll see you Wednesday night.
Wednesday, try to identify all the causal arguments, because we'll probably spend quite a bit of time talking about those, and we may even go back to some of the ones from the other LR section if necessary. But I want to make sure we give you guys the causal framework.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.